The hour was deep, a sepulchral time when the city outside my window finally surrendered its roar to a muffled, rain-slicked silence. Inside the small, fluorescent-lit clinic attached to my cheap student apartment, the air was thick with the sterile bite of antiseptic and the oppressive musk of old textbooks. I was hunched over a skeletal model, tracing the delicate architecture of the ribcage, trying to memorize the exact pathway of the subclavian artery, when the silence fractured. It was a sound out of place, not the usual drunken shouts or the rumble of the late-night tram, but a heavy, sickening thud, followed by a low, ragged scrape that sounded too close to human effort, my pencil stilled over the anatomical sketch. The sound came from the narrow, refuse-strewn alley that separated my clinic's back door from the brick wall of the adjoining warehouse. Instinct, honed by years of medical training, overruled the instinct for self-preservation. I slid off the stool, my white coat brushing against the cold steel of the examination table. My heart began a tight, rapid drumming against my ribs. I moved silently through the cramped prep room, pulling back the heavy bolt on the iron door. The cold, damp air assaulted me immediately, smelling of spoiled refuse and iron. He was there, collapsed against a stack of discarded wooden pallets, a silhouette of impossible size against the grimy concrete. The darkness was absolute, but the street lamp at the corner of the block cast just enough sickly yellow light to illuminate the disaster. He was a man, impossibly large, dressed in clothing that looked expensive and tailored, now ruined by the copious, shocking spread of crimson that saturated the fabric. It was too much blood. The sight struck me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an injury, it was a hemorrhage. For a paralyzed moment, the sheer danger of the scenario locked my feet to the ground. This wasn't a pedestrian accident. Men bleeding like this in shadowed alleys were usually the product of something dark and deliberate. But the sight of his labored, rattling breath, a noise already weakening, snapped the medical student out of the fearful civilian. My oath was a vice. I had to stabilize him. I couldn't leave him to bleed out in the filth. And I certainly couldn't call the police, not if he was shot, not if he was tied to whatever brutality had occurred. I knelt beside him, the damp cold seeping instantly into my trousers. He was heavy, impossibly dense, and completely unconscious. His skin was the pallor of wax, slicked with sweat, and the sanguine tide that flowed steadily from a deep wound high on his abdomen. I looped my hands beneath his shoulders, grunting with the effort, dragging his dead weight backward toward the clinic door. Every inch of movement was agonizing, the friction of his expensive wool coat against the concrete sounding loud enough to wake the dead. It took a desperate, silent struggle of 5 minutes to haul him over the threshold and onto the cold linoleum floor of the examination room. I slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the lock until the mechanism groaned, sealing us both into this illicit, dangerous bubble. The light inside was merciless, exposing the full extent of the damage. I ripped a pair of latex gloves from the dispenser, my hands trembling violently. I needed to see the wound, but the jacket and shirt were fused to his skin by dried blood. Snatching the trauma shears, I began the slow, fraught process of cutting away the ruinous fabric. The jacket was fine, dark cashmere. The shirt beneath, custom-made silk. As I cut the shirt away from his chest, peeling the sodden material back like old wallpaper, I finally saw him fully. He was devastatingly built, carved from granite, but it was not the musculature that stole my breath. It was the ink. Etched across the expanse of his left pectoral, curving down toward his ribcage, was a tattoo of staggering complexity and flawless execution. It was a serpent, coiled and stylized, its scales rendered in deep, velvety black ink, its head rearing in silent, predatory menace. The serpent was not just a design, it was a signature. A cold dread, far sharper than the fear of blood, seized me. I knew that symbol. Everyone in the city knew the whispers surrounding black serpents, the organization that moved in the shadows beneath the gilded life of the metropolis. They were myth and monster, and their leader, the man they feared above all others, was branded with that exact mark. My fingers froze on the shears. I had not just rescued a wounded man, I had dragged a predator into my den. I looked down at the pale, powerful face, handsome in an austere, dangerous way, even in the throes of trauma. He was a ghost story made flesh, lying unconscious on my sterile floor, bleeding out the very life I was sworn to protect. I could still call the authorities. I could claim I found him here. But the terror in my gut told me that calling the police would not save me. It would expose me. If he was found, the people who had done this would come looking for the body, or worse, the witness. My breath hitched. The serpent's cold, coiled eye seemed to watch me, even as the man remained inert. The gravity of the secret I held, the weight of this illicit life in my small, safe clinic was suddenly crushing. There was no going back. The decision had been made the moment I dragged him inside. Clutching a roll of sterile gauze, I forced the fear deep down, channeling the terror into a desperate, focused energy. My hands, though shaking, found their medical rhythm. I had to save him. Not because it was safe, but because now our survival was tragically, irrevocably linked. The next 48 hours were not lived, but survived, a suspended state of hypervigilance and chilling necessity. The small examination room, usually a sanctuary of sterile competence, became a crucible. I moved through the hours in a fog of adrenaline, the copper scent of drying blood permeating the air, mingling with the sharp, clean smell of chlorhexidine. His breathing was the only clock I obeyed, shallow and uneven, a constant, low rasp that tethered me to the catastrophic life I had dragged across my threshold. My supplies were desperately thin. My clinic was designed for minor ailments and routine checkups, not major trauma. I improvised, using every last sterile suture, every remaining unit of saline, and praying the makeshift antibiotics I administered would be enough to stave off the inevitable siege of infection. I had to be meticulous, silent, and fast. The slightest sound, the scrape of a chair, the clink of stainless steel, felt amplified into an alarm signal that would draw the world, or worse, his enemies, to my door. I searched for any scrap of identification, driven by the professional need to know my patient. There was nothing. No wallet, no phone, no keys. The tailoring of his clothes was the only clue, whispering of wealth and a life conducted far above the street grime. But the cold, hard reality was etched into the flawless black serpent coiling across his chest. His identity was not written on a card. It was branded into his skin. I spent long stretches simply staring at his face as I monitored his vitals. Even unconscious, he possessed an architectural severity, a jawline cut from marble, a mouth set in a ruthless line, and eyebrows that threw his pale forehead into perpetual shadow. There was no softness, no vulnerability in the features, only an ossified strength that seemed incapable of yielding. It was a face built for command, and the realization chilled me to the bone. I was tending to a force of nature, not merely a man. Exhaustion became a physical weight, pressing down on my eyelids, but I refused to sleep deeply. Every time I slumped onto the stiff, uncomfortable chair beside the examination table, I was immediately jolted awake by the fear of discovery or the fear that his ragged breathing might suddenly cease. The silence of the clinic was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic drip of an IV bag and the phantom sounds of the city outside, noises I now filtered through the lens of potential danger. I was intensely aware of the latent power radiating from him. It was a dense, almost magnetic field, contained only by the trauma that had temporarily incapacitated him. He was a tightly wound spring, and the moment he woke, the fragile peace I had enforced would shatter. I cleaned the instruments, sorted the bloodied gauze into biohazard bags, and changed the dressings, my fingers moving with practiced efficiency, all the while sensing the heavy, dangerous stillness of the body beneath my touch. It was late on the second night. The world outside dissolved into a sepulchral gray when the shift occurred. I was leaning over the table, checking the fever line, when the subtle rhythm of his breathing changed. It deepened, steadied, losing the shallow, panicked quality of a body clinging to life. It became the breathing of a predator at rest, fully recovered. I didn't move, I didn't dare. I knew with the certainty of instinct that he was awake. My breath caught in my throat, freezing the air in my lungs. The moment stretched, taut and silent, until he finally opened his eyes. They were dark, impossibly dark, like polished obsidian reflecting no light, and they were fixed on me. They weren't the confused eyes of a patient emerging from trauma. They were the cold, focused eyes of a watcher, assessing, calculating, and utterly demanding. There was no flicker of gratitude, no recognition of the desperate effort I had expended. There was only the silent weight of his awareness, tracking the tremor in my hand as I held the thermometer, tracking the rise and fall of my terrified chest. He didn't speak. He didn't move a muscle that wasn't strictly necessary. But the confrontation was absolute. His gaze pinned me to the spot, stripping away the white coat and the medical detachment, leaving me feeling exposed and foolishly vulnerable. I was the keeper of his secret, and in that silent, burning stare, I understood that I was now entirely his property. I managed to stammer out a question about his pain, the words sounding thin and reedy in the heavy air. He offered no reply, only the relentless, consuming focus of his stare. I eventually retreated, pulling a blanket higher over his powerful shoulders, feeling the urge to run, yet paralyzed by the gravitational pull of his presence. I finally succumbed to a few hours of uneasy, exhausted sleep in the cramped office next door. The image of his relentless eyes burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I woke with a gasp just before dawn, the silence too complete, too absolute. Dread propelled me out of the chair. I burst into the examination room. It was empty. The examination table was stripped bare. The rough linen sheet I had laid down was gone. The IV stand was folded and pushed against the wall. There was no sign of the man who had filled the room with dangerous energy for 2 days, and, most impossibly, there was no blood. The floor, the sink, the edges of the table, everything was wiped clean, sterile, and cold, as if the whole illicit episode had been a fever dream. He had vanished. He hadn't just left. He had erased himself. He had taken his secrets, his danger, and the evidence of the life I had saved. He had not offered a word, a warning, or a gesture of farewell. He had only left behind the crushing, atmospheric silence and the chilling certainty that the debt I incurred by saving him was not settled. It had only just begun. I walked slowly toward the back door. The heavy bolt was secured, just as I had left it. I placed my hand on the cold iron, my fingers closing around the lock. The life I had touched was gone, but the ghost of the black serpent lingered, coiled tightly around my small, safe world, waiting for the moment to strike. I woke not to the chirping of the alarm I habitually ignored, but to a sound that vibrated through the foundation of the old building, a deep, continuous thrumming, like the earth itself had developed a monstrous mechanical heartbeat. It was a sound of massive, coordinated presence, too low to be merely traffic, too pervasive to ignore. Dread, cold and slick, immediately replaced the exhaustion of the last 72 hours. I stumbled to the window of my cramped living room, pulling aside the thin, dusty curtain. The sickly yellow light of the pre-dawn city was struggling to pierce the gloom, but it was enough to illuminate the unthinkable scene below. My street, usually a mundane avenue of brick and cheap storefronts, had been transformed into a perfectly orchestrated, silent nightmare. The sight stole the breath from my lungs, leaving me hollowed out and gasping. They were everywhere. 200, perhaps more, men dressed in immaculate, tailored black suits, standing with the terrifying stillness of a trained phalanx. They surrounded the entire building complex, my clinic, my apartment, the adjacent warehouse, forming a flawless obsidian perimeter. Black armored vehicles, sleek and silent as deep-sea predators, lined the curbs. There was no noise from the men, no shouting, no movement beyond the slight ripple of fabric in the cold morning air. They were simply there, a sudden, overwhelming manifestation of power and complete control. I backed away from the window, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a cry. This was not a police raid. This was an occupation. This was the consequence of the life I had saved. A car, darker and more imposing than the others, a low, armored silhouette that seemed to absorb all light, pulled smoothly to a stop directly in front of my main entrance. The rear door opened with a quiet, hydraulic sigh, and then he stepped out. Raphael Moretti, but he was not the pallid, dying weight I had struggled to save. This man was a revelation of ruthless recovery. He wore a dark suit of flawless construction, the fabric clinging to the dangerous breadth of his shoulders. His hair, dark and thick, was meticulously styled, his profile sharp and unforgiving against the gray morning sky. He moved with a coiled, predatory grace that suggested the sutures I had painstakingly placed were nothing more than a minor annoyance, already forgotten. He was impossibly whole, dangerously perfect, and radiating a cold, lethal energy that reached up and chilled me even through the window pane. He glanced up. It was a brief, almost dismissive movement, yet his dark eyes, the same eyes that had pinned me to the wall 36 hours earlier, found my window instantly. Even from 3 stories up, the impact of his gaze was a physical blow, knocking the air from my chest. I felt utterly exposed, not just seen, but catalogued, assessed, and claimed. I heard the heavy, decisive knock at my clinic door, reverberating through the floorboards. It was not a request. It was an announcement. My feet moved without conscious direction, carrying me through the apartment and down the short, narrow staircase that led to the clinic entrance. My white coat was still hanging on the hook, a useless banner of the safe life I had just lost. I reached the door, my palm sweating on the cold brass knob, and pulled it open. He stood on my threshold, framed by the 200 silent witnesses. He was taller than I remembered, his presence filling the entire narrow hallway, forcing me to tilt my head back just to meet his eyes. The air between us was thick, charged with the scent of expensive wool, cold air, and the unspoken violence of his authority. "Lina Petrova," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no hint of the ragged breaths I had listened to for 2 days. It was calm, measured, and utterly absolute. "You saved my life." I tried to speak, but my throat was a desert. I only did what any doctor—" "No," he cut in, his eyes unwavering. The obsidian depths of his gaze seemed to possess a magnetic force, dragging the truth from me. "You did what no civilian, and certainly no medical student, should have done. You risked everything. You hid me from the authorities. You sealed my secret." He took a single, deliberate step forward, forcing me back until my spine pressed against the cold wall of the hallway. The proximity was overwhelming. I could feel the heat radiating from his large body, the sheer density of his power. This was not the vulnerable patient. This was the black serpent, fully unleashed. "A life for a life," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming intimate and infinitely dangerous. "A debt of this magnitude is not repaid with money, Lina. It is repaid with ownership." The word, ownership, landed like a stone in my gut. I finally found my voice, thin and trembling. "I don't understand. I want nothing from you. I just want to go back to my life." A faint, chilling smile touched the corner of his mouth, a gesture devoid of humor. "Your life, Lina, ceased to be yours the moment you dragged me across your threshold. You are compromised. You know too much. My enemies know I am alive, and they will know who saved me. You are now a target." He paused, allowing the implication to settle like poison in the air. "I cannot risk losing my investment. You are the only person in this city who knows the true extent of my vulnerability. You will remain within my sight." He lifted one hand, the movement barely perceptible, and 2 of the silent, black-suited men immediately detached from the perimeter, approaching the steps. "Pack her belongings," Raphael ordered, his eyes never leaving mine. It was a casual command, spoken as easily as ordering coffee. "Everything essential. She will not be returning here." Panic clawed its way up my throat. "No, you can't." "I have my studies, my clinic." "You have me," he corrected, the finality of the statement crushing. He reached out, and his large, warm hand closed around my wrist, the grip firm and inescapable. The shock of the contact, the sheer, electric contrast between the cold fear and the heat of his skin, paralyzed me. Consider this the price of salvation, Lina. You bought my life. Now I own yours. I was dragged, stumbling, out onto the pavement. The 2 men were already ascending the stairs, their presence violating the sanctity of my small, safe world. I looked back desperately at my apartment, the window where I had studied, the door that had sheltered me. It was gone, erased by the phalanx of black steel. Raphael opened the rear door of the armored car and pressed me into the plush, dark leather interior. He slid in beside me, the space immediately shrinking, enclosing us in a cocoon of velvet captivity and imminent danger. The door clicked shut, heavy and final, sealing me away from the light. I watched through the tinted glass as my familiar neighborhood dissolved into a smear of urban gray, replaced by the relentless, silent efficiency of his motorcade. The drive was long, silent, and increasingly unsettling. We left the crowded, grimy streets behind, moving into a landscape of dense, ancient forest and high, forbidding stone walls. The air outside grew heavy, mist curling off the deep valley floor. When the car finally slowed, rolling silently through massive wrought iron gates adorned with intricate, shadowed carvings, I lifted my head. Before us stood a structure ripped from a fevered dream, a sprawling, oppressive Gothic manor house built of dark, rain-streaked stone, its high, mullioned windows staring out like blind eyes. Turrets climbed into the damp, swirling mist, and the entire edifice was draped in ivy, giving it the appearance of something ancient, forgotten, and hungry. The car stopped beneath a vast, arched portico. Raphael's hand briefly pressed the small of my back, urging me out. I stepped onto the cold flagstones, the air here smelling of damp earth, old iron, and a profound, silent wealth that screamed of history and secrets. I looked up at the towering, brooding architecture, then down at the man beside me. He had rescued me from the street and delivered me to this cage. My small, precarious life as a medical student was over. I was a prisoner in silk and shadows, dragged into the heart of the darkness I had tried to save. "Welcome home, Lina," Raphael murmured, the words holding a sepulchral promise. He did not wait for my reply, merely guiding me with a firm hand through the heavy oak doors and into the echoing, vast silence of his domain. The interior of the Moretti Manor swallowed the light whole. The vast entry hall was a cavernous, echoing tomb, floored in polished black and white marble that reflected the somber light filtering through stained glass clerestory windows. The air was heavy, smelling of ancient stone, beeswax polish, and the faint metallic scent of ozone that seems to accompany immense power. I stood rigid beside Raphael, feeling impossibly small beneath the towering, vaulted ceiling where shadows clung like thick black velvet. He released my arm, but the magnetic field of his presence held me captive. Every footfall of his expensive leather shoes on the marble floor resonated, a sound of absolute command in the sepulchral silence. I saw the movement of men, shadows in tailored suits, gliding silently into alcoves and recesses, melting into the architecture. They were unseen sentinels, and their silence was more terrifying than any army's roar. This was not a home. It was a fortress, an ossified heart of cold, ruthless dominion. Raphael led me through a series of increasingly elaborate rooms, a library lined with leather-bound tombs, a drawing room draped in heavy, faded tapestries depicting forgotten battles, until we reached a suite on the second floor. It was luxurious, with silk wallpaper and windows overlooking the mist-shrouded grounds. but the elegance only served to sharpen the edges of the gilded cage. My small, pathetic suitcase, containing the few essentials his men had grabbed, sat innocently beside a massive four-coaster bed. He turned to face me, his body filling the doorway, sealing the exit with his sheer physical density. His dark eyes swept over the room, then returned to me, assessing the impact of the transition. I hugged my arms to my chest, trying to project a semblance of composure, but the tremor running through my hands betrayed me. "You will reside here, Lina," he stated, his voice quiet, yet cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "This wing is secure. You will not leave it without escort. Your life is valuable, and I intend to protect my investment." "Investment," I whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You speak as if I were a commodity, not a person." His jaw tightened, a movement barely perceptible, yet radiating an undeniable impatience. "You are both. You are the only person who has seen me at my weakest and who understands the extent of the damage inflicted. That knowledge makes you a liability to my enemies and, therefore, invaluable to me. You are not a guest, Lina. You are a necessary fixture, a strategic asset." He took a step closer, and I instinctively retreated until the cool satin damask of the wall pressed against my back. The air was suddenly thick with the scent of his cologne and the raw, untamed power he carried. "You are under my protection now. That is not a request, it is a declaration. No one who wishes me harm will touch you." The intensity of his gaze was suffocating. I felt the cold, hard logic of his argument attempting to override my fear. He wasn't threatening me, he was claiming me, wrapping my existence in the impenetrable armor of his influence. "I had a life, Raphael," I managed, forcing strength into my voice. "I am a medical student. I have classes, exams. I cannot simply disappear." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of cold consideration. "That is a valid concern. Your skills are unique and useful. I did not purchase a drone, Lina. I purchased a mind. Your education will continue." I blinked, stunned by the unexpected concession. "You mean I can return to the university?" A faint, humorless smile played on his lips. "No, you will not leave this property. You will continue your studies here. Any materials you require, any texts, any digital lectures, they will be procured and brought to this room. Your professors will be informed you are taking an unscheduled sabbatical for private medical training. They will not argue." The freedom he offered was instantaneously tainted by the implication of absolute control. My studies, my intellectual sanctuary, were now merely another facet of my captivity, monitored and managed by the Mafia boss. He moved to the door and opened it slightly, revealing a man standing silently in the hallway. He was immense, built like rough-hewn granite, with eyes that saw everything and conveyed nothing. He wore the same impeccable black suit as the others, but there was a distinct air of permanence about him. "This is Victor," Raphael announced, nodding toward the guard. "He is assigned to you. He is a ghost. He will remain outside this suite at all times. If you require anything, you ask him. If you attempt to leave, he will prevent it. If anyone attempts to enter, he will eliminate them." The casual brutality of the last phrase sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Victor gave a small, silent nod, acknowledging the command like a loyal, deadly shadow. Raphael turned back, his gaze lingering on my face, a gaze that was both possessive and calculating. "You are safe here, Lena, as long as you adhere to the rules. Your body is now too vital for me to risk it in the chaos outside. Your skills are mine. Your time is mine. Your protection is absolute." I finally understood the full, chilling weight of the transaction. My medical competence, the very thing I had used to save him, was the currency of my imprisonment. I wasn't just a witness. I was a living, breathing component of his infrastructure. I was the private physician to the Black Serpent, permanently on retainer, permanently trapped. "And what if I need to examine you again?" I asked, pushing the professional boundary, needing to assert some fragment of my identity as a doctor. Raphael paused, and the darkness in his eyes seemed to deepen, drawing me in. "Then you will be summoned. You will touch me, Lina, only when I permit it, and only for the purpose of maintaining my strength." He took a final, slow step toward me, and I braced myself, expecting a threat, a final assertion of dominance. Instead, he simply reached out, his large hand brushing a stray strand of hair from my cheek. The contact was brief, cold, and intensely intimate. It was an involuntary, predatory gesture of claiming. "You saved me, cara," he murmured, the Italian term of endearment sounding like a warning in his deep voice. "And now I look at you, and I see the fragile thread that pulled me back from the void. That thread will not be cut." He watched my reaction, the wide, horrified eyes, the shallow breath, and a strange, complex expression, almost akin to satisfaction, crossed his features. It wasn't purely lust, nor was it just power. It was the cold, protective intensity of a man who had acquired something precious and entirely necessary. As he finally left, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, sealing me in with the ubiquitous presence of Victor outside, the pure, clean fear I had felt on the street began to mutate. It mixed with the confusing heat left by his touch, the unsettling weight of his constant, protective gaze. I was terrified of him, yes, but beneath the terror, a visceral, dangerous curiosity began to bloom. I was trapped, utterly alone in his dark, echoing manner, and I realized with a sickening lurch that I was beginning to study my captor with the same relentless focus I applied to anatomy. Raphael Moretti had not just dragged me into the darkness, he had made himself the only source of light within my new, suffocating reality. The decision to send me back into the world, however guarded, was Raphael's tactical concession. I had argued, with a desperate edge to my voice, that studying in isolation would destroy my focus, that I needed the tactile reality of the anatomy lab, the competitive atmosphere of the lecture halls. He had listened, leaning against the doorway of my gilded cage, his face unreadable. "If you must be seen," he had finally decreed, "then you will be seen as mine. Visibility can be a stronger deterrent than secrecy." So I was returned to the university, a place I had once considered my sanctuary, now merely another stage for my captivity. The University of St. Jude was an edifice of severe, ancient beauty, a monument to centuries of cold, relentless learning. It was built of dark, rain-streaked granite, draped in heavy, clinging ivy that seemed to absorb the light even on the brightest days. The air in its quadrangles smelled of damp stone, decaying leaves, and the faint, sweet scent of old parchment. The contrast between the sterile precision of medical study and the brutal chaos of my reality was dizzying. I would sit in the vast, tiered auditorium, the meticulous diagrams of the brachial plexus displayed on the screen, while outside the lecture hall door, Victor and two other shadows stood sentry. They were impossible to ignore, immense, quiet men in flawless black suits who moved with a terrifying economy of motion. Their presence was a physical wall, separating me entirely from my peers. The whispers began immediately. Not just whispers of my sudden, unexplained absence and return, but sharp, venomous speculation about the men who guarded the doors, who followed my every step to the cafeteria, who waited silently beside the dissection tables. I felt their judgment like a rash, the sudden, complete ostracization of being branded untouchable. I was not Lena Petrova, dedicated medical student anymore. I was the girl claimed by the darkness, the trophy polished by the Moretti name. One afternoon, I sought refuge in the university's main library, a cathedral of learning with soaring, vaulted ceilings and endless canyons of shelving. I had found a secluded carrel in the deepest, shadow-drenched corner of the anatomy section, hoping the sheer weight of knowledge surrounding me might offer a temporary barrier against the outside world. I was bent over a massive, leather-bound volume detailing the musculature of the neck, the complex network of human vulnerability and strength laid bare on the page. A shadow fell across the page, eclipsing the weak light filtering through the high window. I stiffened, recognizing the scent of expensive, generic cologne that wasn't Raphael's. I looked up and saw Julian, a rival student known for his ambitious cruelty and sharp eyes. He was holding a stack of books, but his gaze was fixed on me, cold and calculating. "Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," he sneered, his voice low, but carrying enough malice to penetrate the library's enforced silence. "Heard you were on a little holiday. Private lessons in advanced trauma, perhaps? Or were you just too busy cleaning up the mess?" I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, realizing he knew, or at least suspected, the truth. Gossip, fueled by fear and resentment, must have been circulating about the massive incident the night I found Raphael. "I don't know what you're talking about, Julian," I murmured, trying to gather my books and retreat. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowed with predatory interest. "Oh, I think you do. It's hard not to notice when the new security detail looks less like bodyguards and more like pallbearers. Very dedicated, those fellows. Must be nice, having that kind of protection." He let the word hang in the air, weighted with implication. "Just remember, Lina, the black serpents have many enemies. And sometimes the collateral damage is the softest thing nearest to the fire, like a pretty little student who knows too much." Fear, sharp and icy, pierced the thin veneer of my professional composure. He wasn't just taunting me, he was issuing a veiled threat, leveraging the knowledge of my forced association with Raphael. I opened my mouth to deny everything, to scream for Victor, who was surely just outside the archway. But before I could utter a sound, the atmosphere in the secluded aisle shifted. It was not a noisy entrance. There was no scrape of leather, no heavy footfall. Raphael simply materialized, as if distilled from the surrounding shadow. Julian hadn't even heard him approach, but the moment he saw the reflection of the man standing directly behind me in the polished wood of the table, the color drained instantly from his face. Raphael did not touch me, but his presence was a shield, absolute and unyielding. He wore a dark, tailored coat that emphasized the lethal breadth of his shoulders, and his expression was a mask of glacial indifference, yet radiating a terrible, concentrated violence. He looked down at Julian, and the silence in that narrow aisle became a suffocating pressure. "You find her company illuminating, I trust?" Raphael's voice was a whisper, pitched so low it was only audible to the three of us, yet it vibrated with more authority than any shout. It was the sound of bedrock shifting, inevitable and final. Julian stumbled backward, knocking against the high shelf behind him, sending a quiver through the books. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at the man who was rumored to be a ghost, a myth, a monster, the man Lena Petrova had apparently tethered herself to. Raphael stepped closer, a movement slow and deliberate, forcing Julian to crane his neck to look up at him. "She is under my supervision," he continued, emphasizing the word supervision with cold clarity. "Her studies, her time, her safety, all are accounted for." He paused, and his dark eyes, fixed on Julian, seemed to burn with an internal, contained fire. "I do not tolerate distractions near my assets. I do not tolerate threats." He didn't need to say more. The implied consequence was palpable, filling the air with the raw, metallic tang of fear. Julian seemed to shrink, folding in on himself. He dropped his books, a loud, clumsy sound in the silence, and stammered, I meant no disrespect. Forgive me." "Consider your apology accepted," Raphael said, his tone flat, granting no reprieve. "Now leave, and understand this, Julian. If I ever perceive the slightest flicker of malice, envy, or aggression directed toward her, even a lingering glance, I will ensure your future prospects in this city are permanently curtailed. And you will find that a career setback is the least of your concerns." Julian fled, scrambling past the corner of the shelf, disappearing into the main hall without looking back. The silence he left behind was profound, broken only by the shallow, rapid rhythm of my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the space where the rival student had been. Then I turned, slowly, to face Raphael. He looked down at me, the protective fury in his eyes slowly receding, replaced by the familiar, cold intensity of possession. "You should not be wandering alone in the deepest stacks," he stated, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, the picture of effortless, lethal calm. "Victor was outside the main reading room. You strayed too far." My voice was tight, strained. "You followed me?" "I observe my assets," he corrected, his gaze sweeping over my face, noting the lingering terror. "And I eliminate problems before they require extensive repair." I should have been wholly repulsed by the casual, brutal assertion of dominance. I was terrified by the ease with which he had destroyed a man's future with a few whispered words. He was a monster, a creature of pure, controlling darkness. Yet, standing there, wrapped in the oppressive silence he commanded, I felt a treacherous warmth spreading through my chest. It was the visceral, ancient reaction to being fiercely, immediately protected. The fear was still there, a bitter taste on my tongue, but it was now laced with something confusingly potent. The realization that his protection was absolute and terrifyingly efficient. "You shouldn't have come here," I whispered, clutching the anatomy book like a shield. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers brushing the sensitive skin just below my ear, pulling my chin up slightly. The contact was electric, a sudden, blinding awareness of his physical power and the dangerous magnetic pull between us. "I am always where I am needed, Lina," he murmured, his breath warm against my temple. "And you needed a reminder that the perimeter of your safety is defined solely by my vigilance. You are mine to protect, and mine alone." The paradox of the protector was fully realized. He was the cage, but he was also the only defense against the beasts outside. He had dragged me into the darkness, but now his darkness was the only thing that kept me safe from the light. The night descended upon the Moretti estate like a shroud woven from black velvet and damp air. I lay rigid beneath the oppressive weight of the heavy silk duvet, unable to find solace in the opulent confines of my room. The silence of the secure wing was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum, always threatening to implode. I had just slipped into the shallow, exhausted depths of sleep when the lock on the outer door gave a soft, ominous click. I was instantly awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. A moment later, a low, guttural rap sounded on the inner panel. It was Victor. "Dr. Petrova." His voice was a deep, toneless rumble, devoid of inflection. "The boss requires your presence. Now." I scrambled out of bed, pulling on a thick, dark velvet robe over my nightgown. The air of immediate crisis was suffocating. I opened the door to find Victor standing like an immovable sentinel, flanked by two other men whose faces were obscured by shadow and discipline. The hall lights were dimmed, casting long, menacing diagonals across the polished floor. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a tremor. "Is Raphael?" "Follow," Victor commanded, already turning, "and do not speak unless spoken to." We descended, not toward the main, palatial areas, but deep into the foundations of the house. The air grew colder, heavier, smelling of damp stone and something metallic that I instinctively recognized: blood. The architecture shifted from Baroque elegance to a brutal, industrial severity. We passed through several heavy, reinforced doors, each one sealing us further into a subterranean labyrinth. The final room we entered was a stark, windowless chamber that felt more like a bunker than part of a home. The walls were bare concrete, and the only light came from a single, intensely bright overhead lamp that cast harsh shadows, creating a macabre tableau. My breath hitched in my throat. Raphael stood near the center of the room, his black coat shimmering in the sterile light, looking incongruous and terrifyingly clean against the backdrop of violence. Two other men stood near him, their expressions grim. But it was the figure slumped on the cold concrete floor that stole the air from my lungs. He was a man, barely recognizable as such, bound at the wrists and ankles. The extent of his injuries was horrific. This was not the trauma of a street fight or a stray bullet. This was calculated destruction. My clinical training asserted itself instantly, overriding the rising gorge of sheer terror, forcing me to categorize and assess the damage. "He requires stabilization." Raphael's voice was utterly flat, devoid of emotion. "He is not to die yet. Ensure he is coherent enough to speak again by sunrise. The casual brutality of the command shattered the last of my illusions about the man who had claimed me. I had known Raphael was dangerous, but seeing the immediate aftermath of his work, the pure, unadulterated darkness of the Black Serpents, was a visceral shock. I was standing in an ossuary of his making. I forced myself forward, dropping my medical bag beside the victim. The smell was overwhelming: stale sweat, fear, and the thick, coppery scent of fresh lacerations. I worked silently, focusing on the mechanics of suturing deep cuts, staunching hemorrhages, and administering pain relief. Every movement was precise, professional, yet beneath the surface, a wave of profound nausea washed over me. I was saving this man only so he could be broken again. I was a tool of their cruelty. Throughout the agonizing hour of treatment, Raphael did not move. He stood, observing my every focused move with an unnerving intensity. When I finally stepped back, wiping my blood-slicked hands on a sterile towel, I avoided his eyes, unable to reconcile the sophisticated man who quoted philosophy with the silent architect of this chamber. "He is stable for now," I reported, my voice shaky despite my efforts. "He needs continuous monitoring, antibiotics, and rest." Raphael nodded slowly. "Rest is a luxury he will not receive. But your work is acceptable, Doctor." He gave a curt gesture to Victor and the other guards. "You may wait outside." The men filed out, their footsteps echoing briefly before the heavy door shut, sealing us in the cold, bright room with the unconscious victim. The silence was immense, charged with the residue of violence. I gathered my supplies, desperate to leave, when Raphael finally moved. He walked toward me, his shadow lengthening and engulfing mine. My heart rate accelerated instantly, not from fear of the victim, but of the predator standing over me. He stopped inches away, extending his left hand. The contrast between his impeccably tailored sleeve and the raw skin of his wrist was stark. There was a fresh, deep cut running diagonally across his palm, still weeping dark arterial blood. It was clean, likely inflicted by a knife during the interrogation, perhaps a careless slip or a deliberate move to force a reaction. "Tend to this," he ordered, his voice low, demanding. "I find these minor injuries irritating." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look at the wound, not his face. He was deliberately creating intimacy in this chamber of horrors. I pulled out antiseptic and a needle, the professional routine kicking in like a shield. As I cleaned the wound, our proximity became suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and the lingering metallic tang of blood, overlaid by the sharp, expensive cologne he always wore. I had to brace my hip against the cold concrete table to keep my hands steady. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of surgery, were now tracing the lines of his palm, a hard, powerful hand built for command and destruction. I felt the heat radiating from his skin and the slight, involuntary tremor of his muscle beneath my touch. He watched me, his gaze locked onto my face with an intensity that made the small, cold room feel scorching. I could feel the obsessive focus in his eyes, tracking the slight arch of my brow, the rapid flicker of my lashes. When I had finished the stitches, pulling the silk thread taut, I reached for the gauze. He didn't move his hand away. Instead, he subtly gripped my wrist, stopping my movement. It was not painful, but the silent assertion of control was absolute. I looked up, finally meeting his gaze, and the breath caught in my throat. The coldness was gone. In the harsh glare of the overhead lamp, his dark eyes were burning, focused entirely on me. It was not mere lust. It was a deep, possessive fire, a terrifying recognition. He had pulled me into his orbit, and now he saw me not just as an asset, but as a necessary, fragile possession. "You handle the instruments well, Lina," he murmured, his voice rough, intimate, a jarring sound in that terrible room. "You are precise, unflinching." "It is my training," I whispered, trying to pull my wrist free, but his grip remained firm. The forbidden attraction, always a simmering undercurrent, boiled violently to the surface. I was disgusted by the violence surrounding us, yet thrillingly aware of the sheer, raw power of the man holding me captive. "Training, yes," he conceded, his thumb brushing lightly across the sensitive pulse point of my wrist. "But beneath the discipline, there is a certain fire, a curiosity. You look at me and you dissect the monster you saved." I couldn't deny it. I was terrified of him, yet my fascination was consuming. He was the darkness that now defined my world, and I was dangerously close to accepting that definition. He released my wrist just as suddenly as he had taken it, his eyes lingering for one final, devastating moment. "Go, Kara," he instructed, the endearment a cold brand. "Return to your rooms. You have seen enough of the serpent's world for one night. But remember this, Lina. When you see the true extent of the shadows, you are always safest standing directly beside the man who casts them." I gathered my bag, turning away from the sight of the broken man on the floor, turning away from the man who had broken him. As Victor escorted me back up into the quiet luxury of the upper floors, the metallic scent of blood and the expensive, demanding scent of Raphael's cologne mingled in my senses, a dangerous, intoxicating perfume that sealed my fate. The storm arrived not as a gradual descent, but as a violent, immediate assault. The ancient manor, already a fortress of secrets, seemed to shrink and buckle beneath the weight of the torrential deluge. Outside my window, the wind howled a raw, predatory sound that mirrored the chaos coiled tight within my own chest. Sleep was an impossibility. The image of the bloodied man in the bunker, the scent of antiseptic mingling with raw violence, had irrevocably poisoned the quiet luxury of my room. I paced the length of the carpet, the heavy velvet of my robe offering no comfort against the cold dread that clung to my skin. I needed air. I needed distance from the suffocating possession Raphael had claimed over me. Yet, an hour later, I found myself drawn, like a moth to a devastating flame, out of the safety of my wing and into the silent corridors of the house. The main library was dark, but a thread of pale, concentrated light spilled from the doorway of Raphael's private study, a room I had been forbidden to enter. The isolation of the storm had seemingly loosened the rigorous security, or perhaps the guards knew better than to interrupt the master of the house when the elements raged. I pushed the heavy oak door inward just enough to slip through, the air immediately growing heavier, smelling of aged paper, pipe tobacco, and the faintest, sharp hint of ozone. The room was immense, lined floor to ceiling with books bound in leather so dark they seemed to absorb the light. A single heavy bronze lamp cast a small golden pool over the expansive mahogany desk. Raphael sat there, not in his usual posture of unyielding command, but slightly slumped, The rigid armor of his tailored suit loosened. His white shirt was open at the collar, the dark silk tie discarded on a stack of ledgers. He was surrounded by sprawling documents, maps, old photographs, and heavy bound books whose covers were brittle with history. His hair, usually immaculate, was slightly disheveled, and the intense focus in his dark eyes was etched with a profound, skeletal exhaustion I had never witnessed. He looked less like a monster and more like a man burdened by an empire of shadows. He didn't look up immediately. He was running a long, elegant finger across a line of archaic script, muttering something in rapid Italian too low for me to discern. I stood near the threshold, watching the flicker of vulnerability, a sight more terrifying than any threat he had issued. This was the man beneath the polished veneer, the exhausted architect of the darkness that now consumed my life. The need to approach was physical, irresistible. It wasn't the impulse of a captive to flee, but the morbid curiosity of a scientist confronting a phenomenon she desperately needed to categorize. I took 2 slow steps toward the desk, and the floorboards gave a faint, almost imperceptible creak. That sound was enough. Raphael's head snapped up. The exhaustion vanished, replaced instantly by the familiar, concentrated intensity. He stared at me, his eyes twin pools of shadow and fire, waiting for me to justify the transgression. I didn't apologize. Instead, I walked around the edge of the desk and stopped a respectful but deliberate distance away. My gaze snagged, not on his face, but on the exposed V of his throat. And there it was, the thin, barely noticeable line of the suture scar I had placed near his clavicle, just above the heavy, rhythmic beat of his heart. "Does it still ache?" I asked, the question startlingly soft in the echoing room. It was not a medical inquiry. It was a reckless attempt to bridge the gulf between the man I had saved and the monster who held me prisoner. He leaned back slowly in his leather chair, his lips barely curving. "The wound you closed?" His voice was low, resonant, a counterpoint to the drumming rain outside. "Or the wound that caused it?" "The scar, Raphael," I insisted, ignoring the evasion. "The one near your heart. Was it business?" He studied me for a long moment, assessing the risk of my inquiry. "It was a necessary reminder," he finally said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that even the most vital organ can be breached, that loyalty is a myth manufactured by the timid." He shifted, pushing the documents aside with an impatient sweep of his hand. Then, with unnerving slowness, he reached across the polished wood and closed his hand around mine, which had been resting tentatively on the edge of the desk. The contact was instantaneous, brutal, and entirely consuming. His skin was warm, dry, and terrifyingly strong. The sheer kinetic weight of his power settled over me, anchoring me to the spot. "You ask too many questions, Lena," he murmured, his thumb tracing the blue vein visible beneath the pale skin of my wrist. "You look at the scar and you see the injury. I look at you and I see the inevitable cure and the catastrophic poison." My breath hitched. I should have been fighting, pulling away from the hand that controlled empires and dispensed death. But the fear, though present, was dissolving into a dizzying rush of reckless, forbidden desire. My heart hammered against my ribs, confirming the terrible realization I had been running from the darkness anymore. I wanted to understand the man who commanded it. The torrential storm outside felt like white noise, isolating us completely. The air between us was electric, thick with unspoken violence and need. I realized with a sickening clarity that the intense vigilance he directed at me was not merely possession, it was a need as fundamental and dangerous as the survival instinct that had driven him to my clinic. "You saved me," he breathed, his gaze dropping to my lips. "And now you haunt me." He did not release my hand. Instead, he used the captive leverage of my wrist to pull me forward, closer to the desk, closer to the golden circle of lamplight and the encompassing shadow of his body. I resisted for a fraction of a second, a meaningless gesture of defiance, before the pull became too strong. He rose, fluid and sudden, towering over me. His other hand lifted, cupping the side of my face, his touch both rough and careful, like handling an artifact he feared might shatter. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a consuming hunger that darkened his eyes to pure obsidian. "Tell me you don't feel it, Lina," he challenged, his voice a low, demanding rasp. "Tell me you don't feel the boundaries shattering." I couldn't speak. I could only stare into the terrifying depth of his gaze, acknowledging the truth. The line between my fear and my fascination had vanished entirely. I had walked willingly into the deepest part of his shadow. And then he closed the distance. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, searing claim, fueled by days of stifled tension and the violence of the storm. His lips were firm and demanding, tasting faintly of whiskey and the cold, metallic tang of the power he wielded. He devoured my breath, pulling me against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. His arms wrapped around me, crushing me against the expensive fabric of his shirt, a cage of steel and silk. I responded instantly, fiercely, the long-suppressed desire erupting like a wildfire. My hands clawed instinctively at his shoulders, gripping the solid muscle beneath the cloth. It was a kiss of absolute surrender, a moment where the entire world shrank down to the confines of his study, the sound of the rain, and the devastating realization that I was falling, willingly and recklessly, for the darkness I had saved. When he finally pulled back, he held me suspended, his breathing ragged, his dark eyes blazing down at me. "Mine," he stated, the word a final, absolute verdict. "You are irrevocably mine." The silence Raphael left behind was not peace. It was a vacuum. After the shattering intensity of the kiss, after his absolute declaration of possession, he had vanished, pulled away by some unseen, urgent thread of the Black Serpent's business. He offered no explanation, only a curt command to Victor and a final, searing look that promised his return. The vast Gothic manor felt suddenly hollowed out, its shadows deepening without the anchor of his dangerous presence. I tried to reclaim some semblance of my old life. The sterile routine of medical school was a desperate attempt at normalcy, a place where the air smelled of formaldehyde and disinfectant, not blood and expensive, demanding cologne. I sat in the echoing cavern of the university library, surrounded by the towering, reassuring walls of academic knowledge. I was attempting to focus on the dense, unforgiving text of clinical toxicology, the heavy book resting open on the cold oak table. My concentration was a fragile thing, perpetually fractured by the bunker, the feel of Raphael's hands, and the awful, exhilarating knowledge that my life was no longer my own. I pushed the textbook closer, scanning a passage on heavy metal poisoning when a flicker of white caught my eye. It was not the stark white of textbook paper, but a thick, cream-colored stock, folded precisely, inserted between pages 412 and 413, a section discussing specific vulnerabilities in the human nervous system. A cold dread, immediate and absolute, settled in my stomach. I looked up sharply. The library was sparsely populated. A few hunched figures illuminated by desk lamps, heads bent over their work. No one was watching me. No one was near enough. Yet the message was here, in a place only I had touched. My fingers, trembling slightly, unfolded the note. It was brief, written in sharp, elegant cursive, entirely without salutation. Quote, "The wound you closed must now be reopened. The serpent's weakness is known. We will collect the price, doctor. Be ready to bleed." The air in the library suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Panic, sharp and visceral, clawed at my throat. They knew. They knew not just that I existed, but who I was, the physician, the saver of the monster. The cryptic precision of the threat confirmed the terrifying truth I had been trying to ignore. I was no longer an accidental bystander. I was leverage. I was the bait. I crushed the paper into my palm, the sharp edges biting into my skin, anchoring me against the rising tide of hysteria. I had to know the extent of the abyss into which I had fallen. Raphael had kept me blind, deliberately obscuring the true nature of his war, hoping my ignorance would be my shield. Now, that shield was shattered. I fled the campus, the familiar streets blurring into a terrifying landscape of exposure. Back at the manor, the oppressive silence felt like a tangible threat. The guards were impassive pillars of black, betraying nothing. I bypassed my own rooms, driven by a frantic necessity, and went straight to the locked study. The heavy oak door, which had previously felt like a boundary of sacred law, now felt like a mere obstacle. I found the hidden key Raphael had carelessly referenced weeks ago, a trivial detail he'd never expected me to remember, tucked beneath a bronze bust of Machiavelli. The lock turned with a heavy, echoing thunk. The air inside the study was still and cold, carrying the faint, archival scent of old paper and dust. I moved swiftly, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. I went straight to the large, fireproof safe hidden behind the lower bookcase. It was not locked with a dial, but with a complex digital pad. I stared at it, cursing my lack of knowledge, until my gaze fell upon the open documents Raphael had been examining the night before. Beneath a half-translated ledger, a small, worn piece of parchment was taped. It contained a sequence of numbers, archaic Latin dates, and a single unfamiliar name. Desperation drove me. I input the sequence of numbers, a lengthy, illogical string, and the safe clicked open, revealing a tiered interior filled not with gold or weapons, but with history. Heavy, bound files, their covers brittle with age, dominated the space. I pulled out the top folder, the paper inside yellowed and fragile. The documents were heavily coded, interspersed with photographs of men I didn't recognize, maps marked with impenetrable geographic coordinates, and, most damningly, a detailed timeline. The dates stretched back 40 years, tracing a sprawling, intercontinental vendetta. The names were unfamiliar, but the context was agonizingly clear. This was a war of dynasties, an old and toxic rivalry for control of the organization, the black serpents. My initial act of compassion had not just saved a wounded man, it had inserted me directly into the crosshairs of a generational conflict. I was a casualty waiting to happen, a new, bright vulnerability in a decades-old fortress. I was still standing by the safe, the brittle paper clutched in my hand, when the door swung open without warning. The sudden rush of cold air and the heavy scent of rain and expensive leather announced his return. Raphael stood framed in the doorway, his black overcoat glistening with moisture, his posture rigid with the lingering tension of whatever crisis had demanded his absence. He took in the scene instantly, the open safe, the files scattered on the desk, the terror frozen on my face. His exhaustion, which I had glimpsed the night before, was gone, replaced by a terrifying, concentrated fury. His eyes were black, bottomless pits of controlled rage. He didn't shout. He simply closed the door and began to walk toward me, slow and deliberate, a predator stalking its prey. "You violate my explicit command, Kara," he stated, his voice dangerously low, the endearment sounding like a threat. "And you search for the answers I deliberately withheld." I took a step back, instinctively pulling the crumpled note from my pocket and slamming it onto the desk. The fear was still there, but it was now weaponized by raw indignation. "I found this in my textbook, Raphael. At the university, where you promised I was safe. They know who I am. They know that saving you was my weakness. This isn't about loyalty or curiosity. This is about survival." I gestured wildly toward the scattered files and the open safe. "This isn't a skirmish. This is a war that started before I was born. How many bodies have piled up for those codes, those territories? And now I am the most exposed part of your empire. Tell me, Raphael, tell me the truth. How deep is the danger you have drowned me in?" He stopped inches from me, his immense presence swallowing the light. He glanced down at the crumpled note, his jaw hardening, then dismissed it entirely. His gaze snapped back to mine, dark and utterly devoid of softness. "The danger is absolute, Lina," he admitted, his voice a guttural rasp that scraped against the silence. "The war is eternal, and yes, they see you as my vulnerability. They see you as the soft, exposed throat of the serpent." He reached out, not to comfort, but to claim. His hand clamped around my upper arm, the grip tight, possessive, a silent assertion that though I was a pawn, I was his pawn. The rough wool of his coat pressed against my cheek. I stared up at him, breathless, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the cage of my ribs. "But they misunderstand," he continued, his eyes burning with an intense, terrifying realization. "A true serpent does not allow its throat to be exposed. I have built walls around you, Lina, strong walls of steel and blood. You are not the weakness. You are the essential fixture. And now that you know the depth of the darkness, you must understand this. The only way to survive the war is to stand so close to me that our shadows become one." The admission was everything I had feared and everything the reckless, desperate part of me had wanted. The truth was not freedom. It was a shackle forged in fire. He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear, the scent of rain and danger overwhelming. "Tell me you still want to run, Lina," he challenged. "Tell me you can walk away from this truth." I couldn't. The terror was real, but it was inextricably tangled with the potent, consuming realization that the closer I moved to the heart of his violence, the more intensely I felt alive. I lifted my free hand, touching the damp wool of his coat, a gesture of surrender to the darkness I had unwittingly embraced. "No," I whispered, the single word an irrevocable choice. "I won't run." The journey back from the university was always a sterile cage wrapped in expensive metal. The armored sedan felt less like transport and more like a mobile fortress, isolating me from the city I used to navigate freely. Victor sat in the front, his shoulders broad and rigid, his eyes constantly scanning the gray, brooding skyline. I tried to focus on the notes I held, a desperate attempt to salvage the identity of the student from the ruin of the captive, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. The note, the threat of bleeding, had already poisoned the air. We were taking the customary discreet route, weaving through the narrower, historic lanes of the city's outskirts, where the ancient stone walls were perpetually damp and the shadows deepened early. I remember the exact moment the normalcy shattered. It was not a gradual deceleration, but a blinding, deafening shock. A heavy, black utility van, materializing from the gloom of a side alley, slammed into the front quarter panel of our sedan. The impact threw me violently against the door, the seatbelt biting savagely into my collarbone. The world became a cacophony of screeching metal, shattering reinforced glass, and the guttural shouts of the guards. I pushed myself upright, disoriented, the metallic tang of adrenaline already coating my tongue. Victor was slumped against the shattered console, his protective gear smoking faintly where the impact had hit. Before I could even register his injury, the rear passenger door was wrenched open with a terrifying, tearing sound of metal, exposing me to the cold, damp air and the three figures framed in the opening. They were enormous men, masked in black balaclavas, moving with a brutal, practiced efficiency. One of them immediately disabled the remaining guard in the front seat with a sickening, concise crack, a sound that extinguished my last flickering hope of immediate rescue. I was alone, trapped in the wreckage, facing the consequence of my choice. The leader, distinguishable by the cold, unsettling deliberation in his movements, reached in. His gloved hand, immense and inescapable, clamped around my wrist. I struggled, a meaningless, animal movement against insurmountable strength, but his grip tightened, pulling me half out of the car. His eyes, visible above the mask, were flat and devoid of humanity, the eyes of an executioner collecting his due. "The serpent pays the price for weakness," a voice, rough and low, hissed directly into my ear. "You are the cost, Doctor." Just as the man began to drag me fully out of the sedan, a sound erupted that was not part of the ambush. It was the roar of an engine pushed beyond its limit, followed by the wet, sickening thud of massive force meeting flesh. The air pressure shifted. The light dimmed further. It was Raphael. He had appeared not minutes later, but instantaneously, as if the connection between us was a tether he could track with the certainty of a compass needle. He was a blur of black fabric and controlled fury, moving with a speed that defied the physical world. I saw the first man crumple before he even registered the attack. Raphael was armed, not with a cumbersome weapon, but with the terrifying, innate precision of a born killer. The scene unfolded around me in a terrifying slow-motion tableau. He was a storm of focused, elegant violence. He moved between the attackers, his tailored coat flapping like a dark wing, The only sounds the sharp, brutal impacts of his movements and the choked, swift expiration of his rivals. This was not the exhausted architect of shadows I had seen in the study. This was the monster, unleashed, defending his territory. I huddled against the frame of the car, watching the ruthless, terrifying beauty of his skill. My mind registered the violence, the absolute finality of his actions, but the fear I should have felt, the pure, paralyzing terror of the trapped prey, was overwhelmed by a wave of something far more potent and destructive, a searing, visceral protectiveness. He was fighting for me. He was risking everything, exposing himself to this brutal exchange to keep me. And then, in the flash of a narrow, desperate maneuver, I saw it, a dark, blossoming stain appearing on the pristine white cuff of his shirt near the shoulder. A flicker of movement from the third man, a silent, swift retaliation, too late to save his life, but enough to breach the armor. Raphael! The name tore from my throat, a cry of genuine, agonizing alarm. It was the first time I had called his name in fear, for him, not of him. He didn't look at me. He delivered the final, definitive strike, and the silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, echoing siren that was already too late. He stood over the wreckage, breathing heavily, the rain beginning to fall in fat, cold drops, washing the blood into the street. His bodyguards, a fresh wave of them, arrived moments later, swarming the scene with quiet, deadly efficiency. Raphael did not wait for them. He turned, his gaze snapping to mine, intense and possessive. He was covered in the metallic scent of rain and freshly spilled blood, his face a mask of concentrated rage that had not yet fully subsided. He grabbed my arm, gently this time, as if remembering my fragility, and guided me toward a secondary vehicle that had pulled up instantly. I stumbled, still reeling from the shock, and then my eyes locked onto the crimson stain spreading across his shoulder. "You're hurt," I stated, my medical training surfacing through the haze of adrenaline. I didn't frame it as a question or an accusation. It was a diagnosis, a command for immediate attention. He dismissed the wound with an impatient shake of his head. "It's nothing, a scratch." "It is not nothing," I countered, the authority in my voice surprising us both. "You are bleeding, Raphael. We need to stop it." He stared at me for a long, heavy moment, reading the furious protectiveness in my eyes. Then he relented, pulling me into the back of the waiting car. The door closed, shutting out the immediate horror and enveloping us in the dark intimacy of the leather-scented cabin. The car began to move, smoothly and swiftly, leaving the carnage behind. I immediately moved toward him, my hands already fumbling in my small satchel for the emergency kit I always carried, a habit of the anxious physician. I peeled back the damp, torn fabric of his coat and shirt. It was a shallow laceration, brutal but superficial, just beneath the curve of his shoulder blade. It was not life-threatening, but it was an undeniable breach, a physical mark of the cost. As I cleaned the wound with swift, practiced movements, my proximity was absolute. My knee rested against his thigh. My breath brushed the tense, damp skin of his neck. The scent of his body, musk, rain, expensive cologne, and a faint, terrifying hint of gunpowder filled my lungs. "Did you track me?" I whispered, not looking up from my work, my voice hushed by the shared secret of survival. "Every second," he confirmed, his voice rough, low, vibrating through the silence. "The moment your heart rate spiked, I knew the line was crossed. I finished applying the dressing, pressing the gauze firmly against the raw skin. I looked up at him then, truly looking, into the depth of his dark, unreadable eyes. The terrifying realization settled over me, colder and sharper than the rain outside. I had witnessed him commit atrocities for my sake. I had seen the full, monstrous extent of his obsession, and instead of running, I felt only a fierce, possessive loyalty surge through me. The boundary had not just shattered, it had been incinerated in the fire of the ambush. I was committed. I loved the monster who had saved me, and I despised the part of the world that dared to try and take him away. I lifted my hand, not to tend the wound, but to cup his cheek, pressing my palm against the rough stubble of his jaw, sealing the terrifying, undeniable bond. "We are safe now," I murmured, the statement directed at both of us. The words tasted like blood and absolute truth. I was no longer a victim of his darkness. I was his accomplice, irrevocably entangled in the lethal cost of his obsession. The imposing facade of the Moretti Manor rose like a great, brooding beast against the bruised twilight sky. The armored car had deposited us swiftly and silently, leaving the wreckage and the blood in the cold, wet streets behind us. I stepped onto the gravel drive, the crunch beneath my boots sounding impossibly loud in the heavy silence that followed the ambush. Raphael's hand remained a constant, heavy pressure at the small of my back, guiding me, possessing me, as we moved through the towering doors and into the library, the room of dangerous truths. The air here was cold and smelled of aged paper and leather, but a fire already crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows that swallowed the guilt and revealed the essential, terrible ruthlessness in Raphael's features. He moved away from me, toward the warmth, and in that instant, he did not look wounded or exhausted. He looked immutable, a force of nature that had just been tested and had prevailed. "They came for you, Lina. They used the knowledge of your existence as a knife against me," he stated, his voice stripped bare of its usual silken modulation, leaving only the hard core of command. He turned, his gaze anchoring mine, black and bottomless. I miscalculated. I thought I could build a separate world for you, a clean one. I was wrong. The moment you became mine, you became exposed. The violence of the past hour, the sickening thud of bodies, the desperate cry of my own name pressed down on me. I understood the gravity of his words. The stakes had been raised, coated in the blood of the men who tried to take me. My survival was no longer a fortunate accident. It was an active, constant battle. The cost of staying has been raised. Exponentially, he continued, his eyes unwavering. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, producing a slender, leather-bound document that seemed to mock the darkness of the room. I have arranged everything, a new identity, funds, passage to anywhere you choose, Switzerland, the islands, anywhere the serpent's shadow does not reach. A plane leaves in 6 hours. Go, Lina. Be the student, the healer, the woman you were before the snow. He was offering me freedom, sanity, a life free of the pervasive scent of gunpowder and the constant terror of the next attack. It was the last gasp of conscience from the man who had dragged me into the abyss. I looked at the document, then at the man offering it. The idea of that sterile, quiet life felt cold, thin, and utterly irrelevant. The Lina he spoke of, the gentle, nervous medical student, was a ghost. She had died in the wreckage of the sedan, replaced by this creature who felt the raw, terrifying vitality of the fight coursing through her veins. The safety of exile was a betrayal of the truth I now knew. It was a rejection of the potent, destructive bond forged in the crucible of his pain and my reckless compassion. "You want me to walk away from the truth I just witnessed?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in my chest. "You want me to pretend the blood on your coat, the fear in my throat, never happened?" He said nothing, waiting, his posture a study in controlled anticipation. He was giving me the choice, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he desperately wanted me to stay. He wanted the choice to be mine, but the outcome to be his. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. The heat of the fire felt pale compared to the searing intensity emanating from him. "I saved you, Raphael." That act was not an accident of compassion. It was the start of an addiction. I cannot go back to the sterile quiet of my old life. It is meaningless now. You dragged me into the darkness, yes, but I looked into the abyss and found it exhilarating. My hand lifted, mirroring the earlier moment in the car, but this time it was not to tend a wound. It was to claim. I let my fingers brush the damp wool of his jacket, settling over the broad expanse of his chest, feeling the heavy, steady rhythm of his heart beneath the fabric, the heart that beat only because of me. "I refuse the plane," I stated, the words resonating with a finality that seemed to shatter the delicate silence of the room. "I refuse the safety. I choose the consequences of saving you. I choose the war. I choose you." I met his gaze, my decision solidifying into an unshakable core of certainty. The fear was still a dull thrum beneath my skin, but it was now subservient to a fierce, possessive loyalty and a desperate hunger for the life only he could offer. I wanted the danger. I wanted the title. I wanted the consuming, lethal belonging. "I am not your vulnerability, Raphael," I challenged, my chin lifting. "I am the woman who stands beside you. Tell me what title comes with that choice. Tell me what I have become." A flicker of something raw and triumphant ignited in his eyes, a dark, dangerous joy that mirrored the reckless excitement in my own chest. The last vestiges of his conscience vanished, replaced by the victorious certainty of the predator. He didn't need to speak. He moved, closing the final, infinitesimally small gap between us. His hands gripped my waist with a fierce, absolute certainty that lifted me slightly off my feet. He pulled me against his chest, crushing me against the tailored fabric, the heavy scent of him, gunpowder, rain, and triumph washing over me in a suffocating wave. He leaned down, his mouth finding mine with brutal, immediate force. His kiss was not tender or questioning. It was a devastating affirmation of ownership, a brand burned onto my soul. This was the victory cry of the serpent who had claimed his essential fixture. I responded with a desperate, reciprocal hunger, my hands gripping the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer, drowning in the darkness I had consciously chosen. The shadow was no longer an external threat. It was the air I breathed, and in the possessive, crushing strength of his embrace, I was finally, terrifyingly home.